Yeah, so this session is focusing on Okta to Salesforce provisioning. The plan is to do a few of these sessions. The next one will actually look at Okta to NetSuite, and we'll also bring in other solutions like Ping and Azure and Oracle Identity Manager. I know they all have these similar names. This concept of an IDP. Just a background about myself. I've been working in this space since 2003, and you can contact me at the below email address for any questions that may come up following this session. And our organization supports customers through evaluating and assisting in audit, security, and controls, including, but not limited to, segregation of duties, sensitive access, patch impact analysis. We've also spent a little bit more time recently looking at the licensing impacts related to security. It certainly seems that where security is over provisioned, there can be licensing impacts with that and additional costs. And overall, our solutions are provided as a service. And that gives you the benefit of the combination of software and services in order to get through audits, in order to ensure an effective security model, and for any compliance such as Sarbanes-Oxley or other types of legislation that may well impact you and your organization. So as I say, we're slightly different to other providers. Other providers focus solely on technology. We combine the two. Because we believe that in our world, in access management, it's quite subjective, and the world customers need assistance with making decisions on what are the right things to do to implement policies like zero trust, least privilege, those kinds of things. Okay, all right. So the objectives of this session, we're going to help you understand the provisioning process from Okta to Salesforce. As I say, in future sessions, we'll look at other applications and services. Understand the key security entitlements in Salesforce that need control and monitoring. Learn about the limitations of identity providers in provisioning. Of course, today's session is focused on Okta. And from there, we'll look at effective controls and workarounds to the limitations that we're going to bring up. Okay, so Okta and Salesforce. When we think about identity providers, the long position, the long story has been an identity provider that provisions users to applications and services within your organization. But with that, Okta, Ping, everybody else are looking at much deeper integrations with these applications in order to be like a one-stop shop for not only provisioning the user, offboarding the user, job changes, but also getting into the sort of gory detail, if you like, of what users can do once they're inside these applications and services. And that's a kind of whole new world. Now, as I say, Okta provides this close provisioning with NetSuite, Salesforce, and more, and it does it with or without the additional license for Okta Identity Governor. Okay, or governance. So there is this not bolt-on, but additional service you can subscribe to with Okta that gives you, more advanced provisioning. But as I say, in the standard product, you can actually provision users into Salesforce with these entitlements. I'm going to see if this poll works. Just to get an understanding of the audience, we'll do this very quickly. I have to find polls. Oh, okay, there seems to be some issue with the polls. I'm gonna skip over this then. I always have trouble with polls on Zoom for some reason. All right, this was just trying to get an understanding of the audience. How many of you have this integration set up? And perhaps for some of you, you might be planning to, in which case this might be a good session to understand some of the key issues. Okay, all right, so let's talk about the theme behind today's session. as I say, we're looking at really two worlds colliding. We've got identity, which has always fallen under this sort of scope of cybersecurity or security at large. And then on the right, we've got application controls or ITACs. These two worlds are starting to collide. Traditionally, on the right, we think about ITACs as something to do with like Sarbanes-Oxley or GDPR, compliance legislation around financials and data. And on the left is around securing our enterprise, making sure the right people are coming in with the right privileges to the services and applications. And what's happening, and what has happened if you're using these provisioning solutions, is that these two worlds are colliding or have collided. And we're going to get into that today. And the implications for you as somebody who works in identity, let's say, and for those of you who work on more of the, the ERP applications, HCM, CRM, the awareness that you need of what's going on in identity and the impact it has on things like your audits, your compliance, and so on. Okay. And some of you may say, well, we're already there. But with this session, we hope to probe a little bit deeper because there's quite a few gotchas, quite a few issues that we need to talk about and start to think about how we work around them. So yeah, as I say, identity providers are playing into the internal control space. The minute that I am able to provision you into an application and decide what you can do once you're inside that application, I become pretty powerful because I might be giving you access to the general ledger. I might be giving you access to accounts. I might be giving you access to set up suppliers and pay them. And you can start to think about all the financial fraud opportunities that come about with this kind of access. It's a whole new discipline. And yet, application vendors, along with the identity providers, are allowing or opening up their applications for tighter integration. They're moving beyond just allowing Okta to create a new user in Oracle, or create a new user in Salesforce, or create a new user in SAP, for example. There's much tighter integrations that are coming, and that's understandable. In today's world, we want a single source of truth of users being onboarded and controlling what they're provisioned to within the enterprise, and get a better understanding of what they can do at a more fine-grained entitlement level. All right, so some examples. Okta provides the ability to perform certain SOD testing prior to provisioning users. As I say, Oracle, etc., have opened up their software to allow for enhanced provisioning. As I say, NetSuite and Okta have a tighter integration than Oracle Fusion or ERP HCM Cloud, for example. But generally, your on-prem applications, EBS, PeopleSoft, Okta has these connectors, and from what we gather, looking to expand their capabilities to provide provisioning, and therefore get involved in this internal control space for these applications. Okay, so how are they doing it? Well, Okta has a workflow tool, and what that workflow tool allows you to do. And if you have questions about this, if it's something you're interested in, get in touch. We don't build, we don't have a workflow product per se. But we understand the workflow process within Okta. So you can create workflows in Okta that says, if I, Lewis, am provisioned to this Okta group, what other groups do I have? And are those groups, do those groups kind of create any kind of conflict? In other words, let's think about a really high level. If I'm a salesperson, I could be provisioned to Salesforce, but I shouldn't be provisioned to NetSuite for the financials. Okay. So at that sort of higher level, we can separate those groups in Okta in order to provide some level of control. And I'll come on to the downsides of this, but one of the issues is that if you're familiar with the rates in Okta, then you'll know that workflows hit those rates pretty hard. If you don't know what rates are, Okta, along with a lot of cloud vendors, are trying to control the amount of resources you consume in their applications. So if you're sitting there all day hitting workflows and doing all this compute, that's going to incur significant cloud compute costs for Okta. So they pass it on to you as a customer, right? So you have rate limits, which says you can only run 50 workflows an hour or a minute or whatever it is you have in your license. Or you can have the super duper unlimited bundle, which on a price per user gets pretty expensive. So there are downsides from a cost perspective in implementing these kinds of workflows. And again, these workflows are around controlling or identifying proactively, any risks that may be associated with provisioning users and their associated groups, which in turn provision to the application. All right, so does it go far enough? No. If an Okta group is assigned to an application with entitlements, the entitlements are the key focus. Okay, and I'm going to spend some time throughout this session digging into this in more detail. So if that doesn't make sense right now, that's perfectly fine. We will get there, I hope. And if we don't, you can ask me a question about it. So yeah, let's do that. Let's go into it. So in Okta, we create groups. And those groups can be assigned to an application like Salesforce, like NetSuite, like SAP, whatever it happens to be. And we can create a segregation of duty workflow that says we want to know if a user gets given Okta Group 1, and in this case, Okta Group 3. Okay, because for whatever reason, we don't want one user having both of those. The issue is that beyond these groups perform provisioning into the application and the permissions associated with the application. Okay. So in our previous example, we had a fairly simplistic model in that we're looking at segregating Okta groups. But the issue is that Okta Group 2 provisions a user into Salesforce and gives them the customer maintenance permission, right? So with Group 2, I can sign into Salesforce and now I can maintain customers, okay? And Group 3 gives me access to Salesforce and gives me access to customer credit. Now, asking you as an identity individual, if that's where you're coming from in this group, what is the risk with that? Well, the risk is that, I can go into the application. I'm friends with a particular customer. The customer's asking for a really good deal. Our standard credit terms are 30 days. I'm going to give them 6 months, right? And now I'm affecting the cash flow of the company. And I'm outside the scope and boundary of controls. An auditor's going to pick this up. People are going to cry. People are going to get upset. People might get fired. So this is where we start to talk about the internal control side. And you'll see that white line in the middle is where we really start to, where those two worlds collide. We've got Okta on the left, we've got the application on the right. And we've got to really start to think about, the responsibility that comes with provisioning users into applications and the entitlements, think privileges, permissions, objects, security objects that allow people to do things, work in screens, work with data within those applications. This is really what we're getting at, okay? So if I go back, like I say, in our previous rule, we were just looking for Okta Group 1 versus Okta Group 3, but actually we need to be looking at Group 2 and Group 3 as a line of separation. And without understanding the entitlements, the permissions that are granted with that provisioning, our SOD within Okta is not going to be effective. And what's going to happen is, on the back end, when the auditors come in and audit Salesforce, they're going to find all these issues, and you're going to have to scramble around figuring out how these users came to be given this level of access. And the answer is, it happened during their onboarding. It happened during their job change, whatever the event happens to be. Okay. So hopefully at this point, you're starting to gain a sort of understanding of the significance of why these identity providers like Okta, as much as they want to get into the space of, full provisioning, full user lifecycle, they're going to have to be, a fully, what's the word I'm looking for? Fully baked out solution that's going to take care of the issues on the right-hand side, which is SOX compliance, audit, data protection, and anti-money laundering, fraud protection, error protection, this whole subject area, which traditionally, the identity world has not been involved in so much. And if you are, hats off to you, that's great. But, most organizations do not have this level of maturity. So, yeah, as I say, when we think about provisioning, we can give a user comes on board, we assign them an Okta group, that Okta group provisions them to Salesforce, but we need to be thinking about these permission sets, these profiles, these roles, and what Okta is actually giving access to once I sign into Salesforce. Okay. And you can replace Salesforce with pretty much any application, because, as I say, if these identity providers don't do this today, it's on the agenda, it's on the horizon for them to be able to go into Oracle, go into SAP, go into Infor, go into Workday, and do this level of provisioning. All right, so what we're going to do now is talk a little bit more about these entitlements, these fine-grained entitlements, what they mean and how we can understand them from a risk perspective. Now, Salesforce does not have the easiest security model. Its security is all over the place. It's got, tons of different tables and different ways of setting up security. It's very complex for what really is a CRM system. And arguably, other vendors dealing with finance and other sensitive critical information could do with having Salesforce's sort of granularity of security that they don't have, looking at you, Oracle. So, straight out the door, when we're provisioning into Salesforce, we have this idea of a profile. A profile is a set of default settings for users to sort of get them going. Okay, so as an example, you have a standard platform user. That's just like, as it says, core platform functionality, accounts, contacts, reports, dashboards, any custom tabs that you've created. So this profile, these profiles are very easy in that they're delivered by Salesforce, and they kind of allow you to get things set up fairly easy, right? If you've got a salesperson coming on board, give them standard platform user, your customizations may well appear in there, but you kind of taking care of a lot of the baseline security, and then you can think about the additional things that they need, any other custom permissions or profiles that you've created. But as I say, for Salesforce, these are the ones that get you off the ground. Then from there, we have something called a role. Now, if you're familiar with applications like Oracle, SAP, Workday, and so on, role is typically defined as a security role. That is the security element that allows users attached to that role to do things within the application. So as an example, accounts payable manager role, we would assume if I get assigned to it, I can perform all the duties associated with an accounts payable manager, right? Approve any payments, run any accounts, all those sorts of associated things. Unfortunately, Salesforce ignored that principle and said, what we'll do is we'll think about a role as being access to data within a hierarchy. So, you can see the diagram there. It's, you assign a user a role. So if I were assigned, down in the bottom left, Western sales rep, I would get access to the California and Oregon data, and I would report up to the Western sales director, who in turn reports up to the CEO, CFO. And the idea being, of course, is that the executive staff have oversight over all the data within Salesforce. So they can see all the divisions, They can see all the financial information coming back about sales made and spend and marketing and all that good stuff. So as you work your way up the hierarchy, the more access you have access to data. Okay. Now, another important point with that is, of course, we're dealing with CRM, and we now live in a world of GDPR, CCPA, and whatever state or locality you live in. I'm sure at this point that locality has some kind of data protection legislation in the works, or being passed, or being implemented. And what that means is these systems are in the crosshairs for those pieces of legislation because they store customer and often supplier data, very sensitive data. People's names, addresses, purchase histories, personal information, biographical information, just the absolute ingredient list that a hacker wants to steal, or somebody with bad intentions wants to get hold of. Okay, so there is not just the financial implications, there is the PII, these sensitive data implications that comes just with CRM. So as I say, bear this in mind, Salesforce role is not giving access to security functions and screens and pages. It is about the data access. Again, it's bizarre. I don't know why vendors do this. Like, stick to the principle. We talk about role-based access control as being the standard. Why go and change it? But they did, and that's that. Okay, so a key point around that is Okta is introducing this feature called Realms, and there's a link to the blog about it down the bottom, but this is taken from a particularly useful blog around Okta maintenance. But you'll see what's on the left, if we spend a little bit of time here, relates to what is on the right. In other words, in Okta now, if you have the feature, if you have the license, you can control not only access to groups, but access to realms. Okay, so you can see in the example there in those black boxes, we've got business unit 1, business unit 2, business unit 3. And within those realms, you can put, as it says there in that middle box, the sales group. Now look at that, how that correlates to on the right. And as we go forward in this session, we're going to identify, some of the issues with these realms and how they conflict with the provisioning in Salesforce, and how this can get really confusing and out of control if you don't put in place some good controls around all of this. So as I say, what you've got on the left is Okta trying to control the data that users can work with via their Okta groups. But on the right, in Salesforce, we've got the role controlling, trying to control the same thing. We need to make sure that these two are aligned. Otherwise, we're going to have some real problems. We could say that realm 1 on the left there gives access to, Eastern sales. But actually, for the users, once they get into Salesforce has got them set up against the West. We've got them looking at an entirely different set of data and user population, account population. We've got some problems now. We've got people working and looking at the wrong data sets. Okay, permission set. So a permission set is more like the role that we come to expect in other applications. This is the settings and permissions, give users access to various tools and functions. We're going to get more into this as we go forward, but this is the core. This is like when I sign into Salesforce, what do I see? What can I work with, right? And then hopefully behind that, there's some data security that says, yes, you can look at all the accounts, but you're restricted to the Western region, to our example. Okay. All right. So the key thing behind this is that in Okta, we have the opportunity, and this is where we really get deep into the provisioning. We said we go deep today. These attributes can be enabled in the profile editor for Salesforce. You'll see on the right-hand side, we've got division, department, manager, role, permission sets. We got licenses. I didn't mention those, public groups, and so on. In addition to what we have on the left, when we create a user, when we push a user from Okta to Salesforce, we're going to create a new user in Salesforce. It's going to have a username. We want their email in there so they can sign in. You'll see at the bottom there, it's got their profile. So we can also assign a profile. I hope at this point, you're already starting to understand the implications of turning this on, right? Because at this point, what we're saying is these attributes, profile, permission sets, licenses, groups, role, that's going to allow us to attach these things to an Okta group, okay? And we're going to get into this as we go forward. Okay, so this is our first revelation or issue that you need to be aware of. In Salesforce, we have permission sets, okay, which is small groups of settings. And then we have what's called permission set groups, okay? And a permission set group is, as the name suggests, it is a grouping of permission sets, okay? So again, think of it like a security group. As a group, if I'm doing accounts payable, I'm the manager, I need all the accounts payable tasks, and I need the management tasks, say like approval or whatever. If I'm a sales manager, I need to see all the accounts. I might need to approve new contract terms, new payment terms, whatever that happens to be. Okay, so a group is a collection of permissions, and a permission set are those sort of more individual permissions that we can assign. So why is it a bug? In our example, this is pulled from our environment. Securing T1 is a permission set group, not a set. Okay. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, number one, I'm in identity. I've got no idea what securing or securing T1 do, but it's been set up. But did the person who set this up understand that Okta is pulling not only the permission sets, but also the permission set group? And I'm going to get into the risks associated with this going forward. But the problem is, as I'm starting out on this, I've got the wrong information. I'm expecting permission sets. What I'm getting is both sets and groups, and there is no differentiation between the two when it comes to setting them up in Okta. So we're going pretty deep here, but this is something you really got to be aware of because of how you can really open up Salesforce unintentionally when you start provisioning users to it. All right, so here's our example. This is a screenshot from Okta. You can see at the top, this is our application assignment, right? So what we're saying is when we, when a user is assigned to this group, this Okta group, when pushing a user to Salesforce, is going to set them up as a service agent. That's their profile. And then you'll see we've got the role. Now, worryingly, this group is set to CEO, which, as you remember from our diagram, is all the data, right? And then below that, we got the permission sets, okay? Not permission set groups, permission sets. And so the risk is that, going back, I mean, look at the power we have here. We can provision a user into Salesforce with a specific profile. We can control the data that they have access to. Okay. And then within that, we can give them additional security. So as an identity professional, if I'm going to do this, I really, really need to understand what I'm assigning. Because, looking at this, it's a service agent for all the data in the Salesforce application across all our regions, divisions, locations, geographies. Is that really what we want? So it puts an enormous responsibility on you as an identity professional, if that's who you are in this call, to understand more about the application if you are being asked to do this level of provisioning. Okay, so, think about this, right? Back to that bug. we got permission sets and we got permission set groups. Permission sets could be easier to understand, like, okay, this is a buyer or this is a salesperson or whatever it happens to be. But groups, like I say, that securing group, like I actually can't remember what I assigned to it. I could have given them God mode, right? Full access to everything in the application. And with that last screenshot, we've also given them the CEO, so they got all the data. So the issue is, on one hand, permission sets can be too granular. There are a ton of them, right? Loads of them. And again, if you don't understand what they do, you're going to need some mechanism in your organization that somebody can tell you for this particular group what permission sets need to be assigned. On the other hand, a permission set group is a little bit easier to work with because it is a grouping of permissions all grouped together into something that hopefully makes sense, right? Like a particular job or a task or a responsibility. So the overwhelming issue is that an Okta group can assign unwanted permissions to the users once they're inside the application. And if you've been here from the start, like I say, this goes for NetSuite, same integration, Oracle, SAP. Start to think about how this is going to impact all the applications in your infrastructure. If we're going down this route of, provisioning users into the application with all these entitlements and access, what are the issues going to be? Okay, so let's look at some specific risks, and hopefully this will sort of align and make a little bit more sense. Manage multi-factor authentication and API. So this, along with some other permissions, can switch the integration off. If we have access to the application in Salesforce that creates the specific integration with Okta, we can go switch that off, and suddenly all our multi-factor is done, dead. People can't sign in. Modify all data. Okay, so this is a pretty scary one. Add, edit, and delete all Salesforce data, regardless of your sharing settings. Now, again, if you've got the role of CEO, when you hit delete, you have the power over all of the data in the application. Okay, and it's a similar thing in NetSuite as well. So, yeah, you can go in, hit delete. And in certain setups, you can also turn off archiving. So you can just delete the whole application and you're done. View all data. View encrypted data. So if you give users this permission, if you have encrypted fields for whatever sensitive information, that permission allows me to go into the page and view it unencrypted. And then, now I've got access to all the data I need. Billing. Yeah, I mentioned that reference before. Manage customer billing, including credit, manage the customer. I can phone up a customer and say, hey, it's the end of our year. If you order today, I'll give you 6 months payment terms as opposed to 30. That's not authorized. I'm not authorized to do that. And again, to my previous example, I'm creating, cash flow issues because I'm offsetting, the revenue for 6 months rather than 30 days. Common issue, especially in the sales world. Right, is to use payment terms. But if that's not approved, and if I have access to play around with those, it's happened. It's been in the news that these things really screw up a company's cash position. So those are some, and we have a repository of these risks. I pulled some out, but there are tons of these risks. But again, if you're an identity professional, what is the implication of provisioning these things in the application, especially for a low-level user? And you know what users are like. They'll go into an application, play around, and, see what that delete button does. All right. So we're in a world where users can, in Okta, we can now provision users via their Okta groups to an application. And now we can go beyond that and start to provision the attributes, the permissions, the groups, the security. What can they do in their application? So what about reporting, right? What about accountability? What about audit? The auditors now understand that we can do this. They want to know, like, okay, show me all the Okta groups and what's being provisioned. Like, how have you got Okta set up to provision to Salesforce? Are there any issues with that? Any holes, any problems, any opportunities for fraud or error. So what's the reporting like? The problem is, and I hate to use the word problem, but we've got to do it before we get to solutions, is that, Okta's reporting is not mature enough at this stage in that it focuses on reporting on Okta, right? So things like we can get users and their group assignments. Okay, we can get the health of the setup, like passwords, failed logins, where people are logging attempt, SSO attempts. We can get group membership. These are all things related to the configuration of Okta itself. However, we cannot get the schema for the application assignment. There is no report that will give me groups and their profile URLs at the top there. There is no report that will tell me what role, Salesforce role, is assigned to the Okta group. There is no report that will give me the permission sets that the Okta group pushes into Salesforce. Now, that's crazy because this information is here. You can see it. You can see that it's stored service agent. You can see that those top 3 permission sets are unchecked. I could show you some that have been checked. That information is stored in Okta. Why is that not available to us? So we've raised an idea with Okta. If you would like the URL for that, to go and vote for it, because as with all these things, it needs voting for the vendor to take notice of. It's kind of important. If we're going to be able to provision at this deep level into these applications, we should have the reporting to support what we're doing. Because if you come to me and say, okay, you've got an Okta group for every Salesforce persona, for every Salesforce user type, let's say there's 100 of them, give me a report that shows for each of these Okta groups, what are they doing? What if I give that group to a user, what are they provisioning? I know they're provisioning to Salesforce. What entitlements are you giving once you sign into the application? It doesn't exist. Okay, so we've raised this as an idea. I mean, in our world, in internal controls, this is absolutely critical. As an auditor, as a compliance officer, as a CFO, if somebody is now able to control, what someone can do once they're in my financial application that I report on to the markets, to the NASDAQ, to the SEC, whatever it is, and we're provisioning users to access and work with that information, I need to know about it, because I've got to sign off on those financial reports that say nobody's been able to tamper with them. Nobody's been able to modify this data. And if I can't get the reports, and I can see in the application that we've got users who, are in sales, who should be in the Western division, getting access to all our data and modify it, how am I going to prove that nobody's been screwing around with our financials to make it look better or worse? Right? That's the challenge. That's so for those of you on the identity side, what this is forcing you to do, and what will force you to do, is start to think in these terms, right? System log. The system log, I'm not talking about the APIs here. If you have the additional API service, which is an additional cost, I am sure some of you may have been able to, pull data from the APIs and somehow put it all together. But the experience within the application is particularly unhelpful, shall we say. So in this example, that's me there, Lewis Hopkins. I went in and I changed a new profile being added to an Okta group with Salesforce Access. So profile is exactly that, right? So like a user agent, a salesperson, account manager. I would want to see in this log what I changed. I can see the schema changed, that I changed something in the data, in the data itself for that group. But I can't see what it is. And at this point, I did this a few weeks ago. I couldn't tell you what it is because I've forgotten. And as an administrator, I've been doing 20 of these a day or whatever. I can't remember what I did 6 months ago when an auditor comes and says, "Hey, look, we've got your time stamped in the system logs with all these schema changes. Like, what did you do?" Sorry, can't answer that. So this process of reporting and the lack of depth in the system log is a real problem because, as I say, when we cross over on that internal control side, on the Sarbanes-Oxley side of GDPR, this level of detail is absolutely required. Okay, so on a personal level, having gone through what is there and what is capable, the question is, with this much power, am I a control owner? Well, yes. Now, the thing is that you might be sitting there saying, well, I'm already a control owner. I'm in identity and I get asked about, our onboarding process, our offboarding, job changes. I'm already identified as a control owner. I produce my Okta reports, that kind of thing. All right, great. Now, traditionally, I'm a specialist in Salesforce. I'm the Salesforce administrator. So when you on the identity side say, hey, we got these 5 new people joining this week, they're all salespeople in the West. I would go into Salesforce. I would, wait for you to provision those users, let's say, or set them up, whatever your configuration is. And I would assign them to the Salesforce entitlements, right? The roles, the permissions. And I would take care of that because I understand Salesforce. And that makes me something of a control owner because, I've got God mode in Salesforce and I could be a risk and, but I've got the knowledge of Salesforce. I understand how it works. Perhaps I've got auditing switched on me as well, right? So Lewis is the administrator. Let's audit everything that Lewis does and let's reconcile it. And we can see that in Salesforce. In Salesforce, we can see that Lewis added this permission to this user that now allows them, because they've been promoted, to be a manager and they can approve certain transactions, right? Can't do that from Okta. But if you're doing it from Okta, it puts you in the same level of responsibility as me as a Salesforce administrator. Because your ability to provision users to these applications, such as Salesforce, can make or break just about anything, especially if you don't understand the application. And there's nothing wrong with that. It might be too much to ask you to understand all of the applications in the enterprise that you're provisioning to. I think on average now, and the mid-size enterprises have over 400 applications. And if all of those are going to go through your Okta setup for provisioning, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, etc., it's a lot to ask you to understand the nuances, the permissions, and the structure of the security for each of those applications. And yet that is what you are being set up for. So a control owner, if this is a term that's not familiar to you, you have risk. The risk is someone could create a supplier and pay them, right? With the risk being that I could go in, if I can do that, I can set myself as a supplier and I can pay myself, right? In a recent example, the US Army, an individual got away with $100 million. She set herself up as a supplier, providing services to veteran families. There was no checks and balances. She got $100 million out of the US Army. And it went on for 8 years, unchecked. So the risk there, exactly to that point, is being able to set up a supplier and pay them. So the control owner, who controls that? Who makes sure that users who can set up suppliers are separated from users who can pay them? Now think about that across all your transactions, right? Who can inflate sales? Who can write down assets? It just goes on and on and on. Who can go into payroll and modify it? Hey, this month I deserve a pay rise. I'm going to update payroll and give myself a nice little pay rise. These are the sorts of internal controls that you're getting into. All right. Now there's a lot to this. I could talk about it all day, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here. And again, I'll leave my email at the end for any questions that comes from this. But what can we do? We have a limited tool set, limited, by its limitations. What can we do? So I don't, feel free to interject for any of you, but we have not found a way to separately secure the profile editor and mappings in Okta. In other words, to say, okay, we need one or more individuals who are the only ones who can go in and say, okay, for this group, yeah, you can access Salesforce, but you're a salesperson and you can only see, data for the west of the USA. And then this group has access to Salesforce and you're a salesperson, you can only see data for the eastern side of USA, right? That would be amazing to be able to have that level of control, because what that means is you only have a couple of people that you need to keep an eye on. If you've got a lot of administrators going in, if you're a larger organization, there's a lot of people who can go in and create these Okta groups or modify them, modify the profiles and say, yeah, now you can, now we can do X, Y, Z, we're in Salesforce. The other way of looking at it is to be able to actually go in and of course, not allow these profiles to happen. Maybe your position is, having listened to what I've said, you don't want to use any of this. You want to stick with provisioning a user into Okta, into Salesforce, and then the Salesforce administrator sets up their access in Salesforce because they know Salesforce and you don't, I don't, whatever that happens to be. Maybe you don't want to use anything that I've discussed. The problem is that because there's no security, there's really nothing stopping, a group administrator going in and just turning this all on. And as you saw from the system log, the event history is not that great. So what can you do about this? Change control. So if I don't know, for those of you on the identity side, maybe this is not something you've gotten involved with traditionally for Okta, but change control is this idea that we want to proactively say, okay, in Okta, we want these 5 groups provisioning users to Salesforce. And these 5, group 1 creates a salesperson in the West, group 2 creates a salesperson in the East, so forth and so on. So we want to create that as a ticket. I, as an Okta administrator, go into Okta, I create those 5 groups. I do exactly what's on the ticket. Okay. I pull the reports, the syslog, which is not that great, but it at least shows that I worked with the schema, and I reconcile that back with the ticket, and I provide either by screenshots or some other method that, yes, this is the configuration. Okay. You might say that's a bit extreme. Well, yeah, given the subject matter of these entitlements and the power that they have, it gets you off the hook because you're going to do exactly what it says in the ticket and be held accountable for that. And then any anomalies, if another individual goes in and just decides to change the schema, that's going to show in the system log, and that's not going to be able to be tied back to a ticket. So now you can do a little bit more investigation, go to that user and say, what did you change? Because that's where we're at. And provide a little bit more control around the actual, changes and configuration that are made with these Okta groups. The other thing is, if you're going to use these settings, you've got to reconcile Okta with Salesforce. Okay. So, you'll see in this example here, this group is the service agent. They've also got the permission set for the API for securing. That permission set allows the user to switch on or off the integration with Okta. Pretty powerful, right? If you've got 10,000 users signing in via Okta to Salesforce, including external ones, and I switch that off, it's chaos. So what we want to do is reconcile that, right? As a manual process, again, taking screenshots, literally like I've done, and then going in, asking the Salesforce administrators to say, hey, for this, for these users, can you show us what they actually can do? Because the other issue is that, you can provision from Okta into Salesforce. Once they're in Salesforce, the administrator in Salesforce can go in and completely change their security, because they're like, what? Why does Lewis have the ability to play around with the APIs? Like, he's a salesperson. He shouldn't be able to do this. So they go in, they change the security, and guess what? Tomorrow you provision 5 more users with that Okta group, and they've got the API permission set. And as an administrator of Salesforce, I come in a week later, a month later, whenever it is, and I'm like, why has this happened again? Why are these users who, salespeople having control over the API? That's crazy. So being able to reconcile these applications is going to be really critical, okay? Because that's going to get you in alignment. And the Salesforce administrator come back and say, hey, look, you keep provisioning users to the application with this API permission set. Please take that off. And again, that could be a ticket, right? That could be something that we can track. So this reconciliation is going to be absolutely critical because there is no automation here. I cannot get a report from Okta that says these users with this group get these entitlements in Salesforce, but I can get a report from Salesforce that shows me the user, once they're in there, what entitlements they have. So it's a big disconnect. Okay, I mentioned before those realms. Yeah, the Okta realms, you've got to, if you're going to use them, they are a fairly new feature. But that's another area of reconciliation. You've got to make sure they match the data security for the user in the application. I've highlighted there the role. So if you remember, the role controls the data that you have access to. So in Okta, I might be provisioned into a group that is in a realm for the West. But as you can see here, the role in Salesforce actually just gives me all data. I can see it for the whole company. So my expectation is in Okta, I'm configured to only work with applications and data in the West, but actually in the application, I've got access to everything. That's a big problem. They don't match. Okay. All right. I think, check for time. Oh, we're pretty much on the hour. All right. So just a little bit more about what we do here at Securing. We can actually report on the group entitlement setup. If you decide to use them, we can report on the profile that you set up, the role. We can report on the permission sets. We can get that information. Okay. And then from there, we can actually reconcile that back with what the user can actually do in Salesforce. So we pull data from Salesforce, we pull data from Okta, we compare the two, we find any anomalies, anything that doesn't match up, and we produce a report that says, these don't match up. Like what you're provisioning in Okta is not what's in Salesforce, and give you a good picture. So you could say, hey, we've got 20 salespeople who have API access. They don't need that. We just need them selling. Those kinds of decisions you can start to make. So we do that work of reconciling Okta with Salesforce, Okta with NetSuite, with Oracle, SAP, whatever it happens to be, to give you a picture of the connection between the two. Okay. And that's what's missing. So huge time saver. Really there to help customers lift out what is essentially an incredibly manual task otherwise. And then from there, we bridge that gap. I mentioned at the beginning, that white line down the middle is that line of separation. On the left, you've got Okta. So we can do SOD on Okta groups that says if you got group 2, you shouldn't have group 3. We take it one step further where we can do that over the Okta groups without the additional workflow costs, but also we can reconcile that with what actually users can do in Salesforce. So we could say, yeah, like group 2 and group 3 shouldn't be put together because they allow a user to get into Salesforce, manage customer information, and also manage their credit. Right. To my example of fraud is, or risk is that I could go in and say, you know what, standard credit terms are 30 days. Let's give them 6 months if they sign today. That's a nice incentive, right? So our company takes care of that, again, that disconnect. We bridge the gap between the identity provider and the applications that you're provisioning to. And this is not just Salesforce. We do it for NetSuite. For any application that you're provisioning to, we can bridge that gap. All right. That brings us just about to time. I'm happy to field any questions in the last few minutes. If you don't ask them in a forum like this, you could just unmute yourself and talk with me. But if you want to email me any questions, lewis@securing.com. And then, in a couple of, we'll be announcing our next session, which is when we look at the Okta integration with NetSuite, which is another popular one. Thousands of customers running Okta with NetSuite. And again, we've got to talk about the issues there, a lot more finance focused. So if your organization is running NetSuite and Okta, as well as Salesforce, let them know, invite them along, because we'll be dealing a lot more with the sort of financial risks that come. As I say, today we've looked at CRM, we've looked at Salesforce, but we also need to talk about more of the financial side. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining. Like I say, left only a couple of minutes. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. This has been recorded. Just check. Yep, it's been recorded. So we'll tidy this up, put it on YouTube perhaps, and then share it out to people who've attended, people who couldn't make it. And you can highlight any of the issues with those around you. So really hope this has been useful. We got pretty deep, but the issues that we've talked about are they're significant. If this is the direction we're going in, then identity providers like Okta are going to have to provide more functionality to support what ultimately will become significant audit problems going forward.